Welcome to Take Note, the Race for Lithium. Take Note is Asia Society India's series of in-depth explainers on emerging issues across economy, policy, and life. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj, journalist and founder of IndiaSpend and The Core, a business news venture. Today, we take a look at the race for lithium, which has become central to clean energy, electric mobility, and even national security. As we read about increasingly, it plays a vital role in powering everything from electric vehicles to smartphones, laptops, and renewable energy storage systems, and has become a strategic resource influencing diplomatic relationships, trade deals, and countries' relationships. The recent US-Ukraine lithium deal is just one example. So to help us understand this race for lithium and what's going on, and more importantly, what lies ahead in this very complex world right now, we have with us Niharika Tagotra, Senior Research Specialist at the World Resources Institute, and Marina Zhang, Associate Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. Let's begin. So what I'm going to do is ask each of you, that's Marina and Niharika, in that order, to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes on how you view this whole theme of the race for lithium before we jump into more specific issues. So Marina, it's over to you.
Thank you for having me. I've been studying critical minerals for quite some while, largely from the angle of geopolitics. As we know, critical minerals, including lithium, increasingly several very rare metals and rare earths. So what does that mean? Well, that means the control of the supply will have geopolitical impacts. And as we have seen, China, since 2003 until now, has increased the list, expanded the controls of critical minerals, including lithium and several other critical metals and critical minerals. So such controls the price have led to shockwave in the downstream producers, including all the industries from mobile phones, electric vehicles, and advanced batteries, and we know that. Consequences are, we witnessed the price surges of such critical minerals, but actually it's not so much in lithium. We have seen in the past couple of years, actually the price of lithium has gone down quite a lot, and recently I think maybe from next year the price perhaps will go up. The reason is because the demand is picking up from now on, and the previous previous years, the demand actually became not soft. Most producers actually were consuming their stockpiled lithium. So China is at the beginning of this year has expanded its control list of critical minerals, including lithium, such that critical engineers and technologies now are not allowed to go out of China. So this will have impacts not just for the buyers, but also for China's downstream, for example, battery producers. So if China doesn't allow its engineers and technologists to be exported to destinations where the battery manufacturers such as BYD and CATL, when China starts to control the exports of technologies, including top critical engineers in lithium, refining and processing, the impact is not just on the potential buyers in other countries, but also on China's own battery manufacturers. Because those countries, to sort of go through the tariffs imposed by both the US and EU, and they're planning to diversify their manufacturing facilities in other countries. But obviously, this is making such business decisions much harder. So this is one thing I think that requires a bit of attention. The second one, I think, when we think about China being a dominant supplier of lithium. Actually, China controls largely the refining and processing of lithium. But China actually faces its own vulnerability in the supply chain, as China relies, as we know, imports of lithium from other countries, including Australia. In fact, Australia is perhaps the largest lithium producer in the world, and China has also relied on imports from Latin America. We know the lithium triangle in Latin America, and extracting lithium actually is energy intensive business. So countries in Latin America, they actually sort of start to push back. And Australia has always, been the ally of the United States. Exporting lithium has been a sort of a politically sensitive business. So if all those countries stop exporting lithium, China will face its own bottlenecks in lithium production. But of course, China has its own reserves, just not as high quality as some imported ones. And another thing I think is we need to pay attention to is Chinese battery manufacturers. They have built its own suppliers from other countries. So they have been doing this for a long time, over a decade. So they do have their own reserves, but the critical point I want to make is lithium is not just a metal. It is the largest metal in the world. It is a geopolitically critical asset for countries, especially when we're sort of all countries are moving towards clean energy transition. So lithium is playing a very important role.
Right. Okay. I'm going to come to Niharika in a second. If I can just pick up on a couple of points. One is when we talk about lithium, I guess people who don't know may use it interchangeably with other rare earths. So, for example, a lot of discussion around electric vehicles has been around magnets and neodymium. So, how are you allocating the priority or the importance of these minerals? Lithium versus, let's say, the magnets, because all the car manufacturers have been talking about that, or other rare earth minerals.
A couple of years ago, lithium was on the top of the list, and I think most countries adopted this strategic stockpiling method. So it seems. Lithium is not that, is not on the first priority, I would say. And you can see this from the commodity market of the lithium price. So I think, if I may say, obviously magnets are on the list, and we know that. And that is being used as a weapon, I would say in the negotiations with the U.S. And we see Donald Trump use his social media and said, well, we got the deal. But do we got the deal? Well, I don't know. China can sort of tighten or relax the control quite easily for several reasons, not just because China is the dominant supplier. And by doing so, China doesn't really face any protests as other countries may face. So it's easier for China to sort of use such leverage, just in the name of national security, in the name of environmental protection. You can just name it. So I think magnets and several other critical metals, critical minerals, are perhaps more important, largely because they are more critical in defense use. So that's where China is targeting at the moment.
Right, and you also said that lithium prices could go up later, but I'll come back to that. Niharika, it's over to you.
Thanks, Govind. Thanks, Marina. I think from at my end, I primarily work on critical minerals, but from the point of view of energy transition and international trade. In fact, I've been looking at the international trading aspects of critical minerals quite closely. And, the perspective that I'd like to offer here is that when you look at the ecosystem around critical minerals, especially the global ecosystem around critical minerals, there are these two sort of blocks that emerge, which we call the core block and the periphery block. And right now, I think we are just heavily focused on the concerns of the core block, but nobody's talking about the peripheral countries. So nobody's talking about, say, Chile or Brazil or Argentina or, all of these countries which are supplying lithium, or nobody's talking about countries in the Southeast Asia, which are huge suppliers of, say, metals like cobalt, nickel, and this is where the international trading regime is brought into the focus, where our research sort of reveals that the problem might just not be restricted to the fact that there is a monopoly of one particular country over the processing of these minerals, but it also might have to do with the fact that the international trading regime around these minerals is extremely complex. It's very convoluted. It's not transparent at all, and that is what as countries from the global north and the south need to come together to work on. We all know that the fact that all of these countries have announced their net zero targets. Governments are moving towards clean energy transition. So, raw materials for any of these technologies, be it lithium, be it rare earths, be it cobalt, manganese, nickel, all of these are going to gain in terms of their criticality. The supply chain vulnerability for these minerals are going to reveal themselves but naturally, as the demand rises, the supply chain problems are going to be underlined. Now, the problem here is, how do you address it? When we talk about China has been working on some of these aspects since the early 2000s. That is when I don't think any of the countries even thought about, how these minerals are going to gain in terms of their criticality. So that was a very forward-looking, very, very forward-thinking process, in terms of how the Chinese government thinks about the future. But now that we are here, what do we do about it? I offer, a perspective from, say, countries of the global south. Some of these countries, in fact, most of these countries are the largest producers of these minerals, but they don't process these minerals. They don't participate in the production of some of these technologies. And hence, there is an extreme commodity dependence that comes for some of these countries. That being said, these minerals form an important component of economic development for a lot of other middle-income countries that are looking to incorporate some of these technologies as a part of their economic development, economic growth. And these countries also include a country like India, which is looking at, relying on critical minerals for its clean energy transition. We have announced a plethora of policies which are supporting domestic manufacturing of batteries, domestic manufacturing of solar cells, modules. But the large question remains, do we have the raw material for this? In recent news, we saw that there have been export restrictions that have been placed on rare earths, which is impacting, the manufacturing of some of these key technologies within India. So you have, the groups of manufacturers, industrialists going up to the government, telling them that the supply chain shortages are creating manufacturing shortages within the country. The solution perhaps lies in the fact that we need to sort of unpack how the international trading regime around critical minerals work. So do we have markets for critical minerals? The fundamental question is that, how does the trade around critical minerals happen? As of now, while these minerals are nationally owned, they are being mined, they are being processed, they are being, converted into technologies by some of the private companies, largest private conglomerates from countries like China, US. They are in these countries mining these minerals and using them for domestic purposes. So 80% of these minerals are mined and processed through long-term contracts. Only 20% of these minerals are traded on spot markets. When only 20% are traded on spot markets, the amount of the level of transparency around their trade is nearly negligible. There is no, if a mineral is mined at, say, $8 per ton, but is sold at, say, $80 per ton. So there is a 10 times escalation in prices. Where is that escalation coming from? How much of that money is going to some of these, these countries that are the original producers of these minerals? So I think this is something which, as a country, India needs to really bring its focus on to sort of try and understand, where do these supply chains originate? How are they, transversing the entire, the entire globe? And where are these minerals then ending up? So that we can find areas where there is an opportunity for us. We have started the Kabil joint venture, but how much of it is actually focused on supply chain diversification, how much of it is actually focused on, bringing in price transparency, bringing in contract transparency. So all of those aspects are something that, as this middle income country that is looking at, incorporating these minerals for the production of some of these technologies, these are the aspects that I think we need to focus on.
Right, thanks for that. So if I can just go back to one of the points you made earlier. So you talked about cobalt, manganese, and nickel. So, and are you saying that when we think about the rare earth supply challenge, we should be thinking about all of these minerals together and not just, for example, lithium or magnets or magnet-linked rare earths that I was alluding to earlier?
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at the mineral composition of, electric vehicles, or battery energy storage systems, or solar panels, or modules, there are groups of metals and minerals which are used, in some of these technologies. These are not just limited to lithium, or these are not just limited to rare earths, but there is a huge amount of cobalt that goes into, the manufacturing of these technologies. Copper, a huge and very important.
Are we seeing? Are we seeing similar supply challenges in these areas as well?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes, we are. For manganese, for nickel, all of these. The International Energy Agency, in fact, defines a group of say 20 odd minerals as critical. For India itself, we have defined 30 group of minerals as critical.
Right. So let me supplement that question. What I mean is there a supply challenge in the geopolitical context that we are talking about in the last few months?
There is.
Okay.
And it, for each country, it differs because, say, for India, supply of graphite is not a challenge because we domestically produce it, so we don't need to import it. But for a country like, for Europe, supply of graphite may be a challenge. In fact, for Europe, copper supply is a challenge. So they have this entire, ecosystem around copper recycling that's going on, where they want to reduce, primary dependence on a metal like copper. So For us, that might not be a challenge, but, how we define critical minerals depends, it differs from one country to another.
Got it. Marina, let me come back to you. So just to, clearly define the mining of the minerals, the processing of it, and then obviously the export of it. So I know, for example, that some of the processing of rare earths that happens in China is imported even from countries like India, because we don't have the processing capacity or as much processing capacity. And you've talked about Australia, which is much bigger in any case. So can you draw that map for us today in terms of, again, if you were to look at the top 3 or 4 rare earths, including lithium, how does it look like? I mean, I know China is 90% of processing, but if we were to see or start seeing shifts, how could that move, as in the processing followed by, let's say, the mining and so on?
Well, China's is really in the processing technologies. So for many of those minerals, China actually relies on imports. For example, cobalt, you just mentioned, is largely from Congo in Africa, and nickel is largely from Indonesia. And China has joint ventures with the largest nickel miner in Indonesia. And lithium is the reason lithium is sort of and the spotlight is because the demand for lithium is highest, because if you look at the battery, as Niharika mentioned, well, many minerals, magnesium, cobalt, nickel, lithium, all include graphite, but lithium is the main element. Battery technologies is advancing in such a way that some of those minerals can be how to say, you don't need to use them, so you can find alternatives, and the quality of the batteries in terms of the capacity won't have much influence. So China is making very strong progress on that front. Niharika just mentioned something that I think that is really very, very interesting. You're talking about the market for these critical minerals. And of course, those minerals cannot be bought by normal consumers because you don't know how to use them, right? So you do need to have downstream industry to use them. So you name it, there are just only a few countries which actually are in the demand position in this entire supply chain, right? And China, unfortunately, controls most of it. And you name it, from EV, from solar panels, from wind turbines, and China controls not just the meat part of the supply chain. China also controls the downstream market. So therefore, I mean, whatever China uses minerals as a weapon is not really it has two it has impacts in two ways. And we cannot just underestimate the signals sent by China, because whenever China said, okay, we're going to control exports of whatever minerals, and we witness price surge. And but the point is, that benefits China. So, but China, in fact, may not lower the supply. So it's a bit tricky question, I think.
Okay, Niharika, you've touched upon where India stands in this dynamic, and as a consumer of rare earths and of lithium also, and we'll come back to lithium in a moment in some more detail. Where do you feel, we are doing a bunch of things right now. The government has stepped up or trying to step up production, is pushing resources towards that. We are scouting around the world. So all that is happening. So how are you seeing the efforts that are being made right now in the context of the demand that you feel there will be, including from the electric vehicle manufacturers, because their voice can be heard very clearly, and their problems. So how are you seeing that?
That's actually an interesting question, Govind. In fact, in one of our research papers that we put out last year in 2024, we did the demand estimates for India in terms of its clean energy transition for a group of these minerals, and the demand for lithium, in terms of correlating it with India's net zero goals, we realized that in 2050, the demand is going to be at least 30 times what we have today. And compared to that, the domestic reserves are probably only 1/5 of what the demand is going to look like. So, of course, there is a challenge. There is a huge shortfall in terms of, where we stand in terms of domestic production and what our domestic demand is going to look like by 2050. Mm-hmm. And most of it is going to be import dependent if we do not take measures. But then if you don't have domestic reserves, that are going to match your demand, what do you then do about it? I think for the government of India, you would have read a lot of, these statements being put out by the ministry about both MNRE and mines, about how we are, going to sort of fulfill a part of this demand by doing a lot of urban mining. Now, what is urban mining? That is recovery, reuse, and recycling. So a lot of our current clean energy technologies are going to become obsolete in the next few years. Now, that presents to us a challenge in terms of the waste that is going to be generated, but also an opportunity in terms of how then we recover some of these minerals from the waste that we are going to generate. So once these technologies become obsolete, how do we put in ecosystems or technologies or machineries which can recover about 90% of our mineral requirements from the waste that is generated? So the idea is that we are going to create a circular economy for a lot of these technologies so that at least some portion of our demand for these technologies can come from, the urban mining of these minerals. So that is part one. Part two is, yes, we are looking at supply chain diversification, and trying to address all of those geopolitical dilemmas that we face. But one can never be sure about these things, there's a statement that says lithium is the new oil. But then we've had our challenges with oil, right? We don't want to be in a situation where even our own import dependence seems like that of crude oil or petroleum, like we had for most part of the last few decades. So the idea is reducing dependency on primary commodities. The third aspect is now looking at some of the alternative form of technologies. So there is a lot of focus on development of hydrogen, electrolyzers. There's a lot of focus on development of some other form of, say, sodium-ion batteries. So the idea is that, because these minerals are finite, there's finitude of resources. How do we address this situation? This situation can be addressed A, by recycling, or B, by looking at some of these alternatives.
Right. I mean, I think oil is a good parallel to work with because we import more than 80% of our crude oil requirements. And we've seen in the last few years how our dependency has changed. I mean, we've gone and, let's say, tied up with Russia to import not most, but a good part of our oil requirements. Other people don't like that, but we've had no choice. And that has obviously helped keep domestic fuel prices low. But Marina talked about, China having partnerships in Africa, in Congo, in other countries. And these are, many of them, I mean, they may be state-led, but they're also private sector partnerships for mining. And India has done and in similar has embarked on similar moves in oil. We've had partnerships with oil companies overseas for specific drilling areas and so on. So how are you seeing that part of the equation, Niharika? I mean, in terms of how India can protect itself once you start looking beyond, let's say, the recycling and so on?
In fact, I was a part of the Ministry of External Affairs when we proposed the Kabul joint venture in collaboration with the Ministry of Mines. And the idea behind that was, this has to be more strategic. This has to be, done with the thinking that in the next 20, 30 years, our dependence is going to increase rapidly. And then what do we do about it? So we have to have these agreements in place.
So if we've done that, so if we have some of these in place, and I'm sure more are on the way, so are we in a better position now as you look ahead, or is there lots of work still to be done?
See, we need to understand one thing about, mining of these minerals. It's not a 5-year or a 6-year process. These mines they take years to operationalize. They take years for some of these minerals to mine, to be processed, to be, to be taken forward to the market. So like I said, our strategy is multi-pronged. Probably, there's a part of the strategy which is looking at, forging these government-led, joint ventures and having these supply-side agreements in place. But that is just one part of it. The second part of it is then, domestically, how we ramp up production. So we are looking at, in fact, in my own home state, there was this news that in Riyasi, lithium reserves have been found. And efforts are being made to understand how commercially extractable they are. Do we have interest from the private sector? Are they interested in mining these minerals? And also because it's a geologically a very, very fragile area. So how do we address that? So, that's another part. The third part is then recovery, recycling from the current technologies. And then, of course, looking for more innovation and more alternative forms of fuel.
Yeah, but you're still saying that the gap between what we will achieve with all of this and our demand and perceived demand in, let's say, 10 years' time is still huge.
It is, if we continue with the current choice of technologies.
Right. Okay. So one of your three options is to shift technologies, and of course,
exactly. So tomorrow, if you actually shift your entire vehicle or your transport ecosystem from electric vehicles to, say, hydrogen fuel, then your demand for EV batteries actually, becomes very, very less than what we anticipate today. So, it'll take that sort of shift in terms of technology choice for India to become more resilient to some of these.
Right. So we shouldn't go from oil dependency to lithium dependency, and therefore we should be having. Okay, Marina, let me come back to you and come back to lithium specifically. So tell us a little more about how the demand supply situation looks like right now, because it did sound like you said there seems to be a surplus, which is why prices are down and things could change.
Since since lithium became geopolitical center attention, or the center of geopolitical tensions a couple of years ago, and many of those battery companies, they started stockpiling lithium, and the price went up. But in the past couple of years, many of those the companies, they start to just consume those stockpiled lithium, so the price has gone down. But as you know, China is still selling a lot of EVs, and now I think the new statistic is more than 40% of the new cars are EVs. And also the first batch of EVs sold in China, some of them sort of reaching the time of getting the batteries replaced or recycled or whatever. So the demand, it seems, is picking up after they finished the stockpiled lithium. So that's one of the reasons. So I was actually in Sydney. There was a new Chinese EV called Tagotra. They opened the third showroom in Sydney. It was really impressive. I agree with Niharika just said. Chinese government actually had this long-term vision, a long-term strategy more than 10 years ago. It's about at the beginning of this century. Exactly for the reason that China concerned its reliance on imported oil was over 2/3 of its oil production or oil consumption. So they considered that was beyond the sort of safety threshold. So the government started to develop EV, and of course lithium-ion batteries, exactly at that time for that reason. If you look at, I like the idea you mentioned, ecosystem. If you look at the case in China, and then of course around 2010, China started to produce its own smartphones. And China started to produce a lot of lithium-ion batteries for mobile phones. And BYD was a battery manufacturer for mobile phones. So the same technology just sort of transferred to batteries for EVs. So this industry development was not really, you cannot have miracle like that overnight. It takes a long time and takes a lot of coordination from the central government to local governments across different industry sectors. So if without such geopolitical tensions, what China has developed could be a technology that could be transferred overseas, just like what China imported technologies from Germany, from Japan, from the US for its own internal combustion vehicles. China didn't have its own technology. But when the table turned around this time, and Chinese technologies are considered, well, a national security threat. And China, on the other hand, well, thought, okay, we don't want to even export our technologies. You see, it's really, in the end, as I said at the beginning, lithiums, doesn't matter it's lithium, cobalt, nickel, magnesium, they used to be just, items on the commodity markets. Now, they're not. They're supply, demand. Everything is determined by geopolitical dynamics. So this is really pretty bad. I mean, those critical minerals, of course, they have very strong use in enhancing a nation's military strength. But also, first of all, I mean, when we decided to develop lithium batteries, the purpose was for finding alternative energy. And the purpose should be used for clean energy transition because we are facing this climate challenge. But unfortunately, things are changed.
But Marina, you did say that, of course, we are in things are heated right now. And
Yes.
And therefore, tempers are running high, threats are being issued, statements are being made. But do you feel that, you said that China is also an interdependent player in the lithium or rare earth supply chain? I mean, because it is importing, it is processing. If other countries start developing their own processing technology, there's more tie-ups, there's more strategic partnerships, and everyone would be racing towards that. China will lose some of its edge in this space. So are you hopeful as you look maybe 6 months ahead or a year ahead that things could even out a little bit, and that'll also make, let's say, the availability of lithium more easier and things could be more calmer?
If I look at from the geopolitical perspective and I look at what the weapons or leverage U.S. has against China, obviously that's chips and semiconductor chip making tools and technology. And what China against U.S. In terms of leverage, obviously is critical mineral processing technologies. But the difference between the two is, from physical perspective, physical principle, we know how to make chips. We know even how to make chip making tools, equipment. But to catch up requires time, requires trial error experiments, is process innovation. But critical minerals is slightly different because, as I said, for lithium, China is vulnerable in terms of its dependence on imported material. But several other materials, several other minerals, China does hold dominance in terms of natural reserves. And rare earth is one of them. So that's why I said lithium is perhaps not on the first priority or the top list, but certainly rare earth is, because you just look around unless there are new reserves being found, and most of those heavy rare earth elements are in China. So. And of course, China also holds the processing technologies. So this makes China slightly sort of in a better position in negotiations with the U.S. I'm not that optimistic. I don't think even with this mineral security partnership initiated by U.S. That includes many countries, including Australia. I don't know whether it includes India, but most industrialized countries. It will take them more time to develop a supply chain that can compete with China's, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of value. I mean, in the end, who's going to buy them? It's depending on the cost, right? And if you're new and if you're using the labor in Australian, I mean, your product will cost maybe 2 or 3 times more than what you can get from China. And at that point, when the Western supply chain reaching the point where they can mass produce lithium products, China can lower the price. Right, and it lacks the control. So that will totally disrupt the market again. So this is just the reality.
Right, Niharika. So I think we have a sense, and it's interesting, that Marina also referred to the fact that companies which were essentially mobile phone companies or had competence in batteries are now car makers. Xiaomi is the latest example of a mobile phone company which has launched a car which is selling like hotcakes. So I mean, obviously we've not had that time or opportunity to develop that ecosystem, whether it's a mobile phone. And who would have thought, today, if India's auto industry is responding to electric, it's really traditional automakers who are responding, whether it's Mahindras or Tatas, and competing with, let's say, Japanese, South Koreans, and you have BYD in India as well. So how do you see this, so one is things calm down and geopolitically the temperature kind of goes down and, we are back to where we were. I don't know, is there an alternate situation that we should be thinking of and contemplating, and if so, how? And that would be one of my, I guess, last questions.
No, I think the India-China relationship has not been like the US-China relationship, to be honest, because the US-China relationship is great power competition. We don't do great power competition with China. We share a long border, we've had our share of conflicts, but we've always sort of found areas where, we could develop some sort of a bonhomie, where we could develop some sort of a collaboration. We've seen, we do see China as a threat, there is absolutely no denying that point. But we also sort of Indian policymakers also realize that, there is no existing without China. When you have those 2 huge markets in a subcontinent, you cannot eliminate, one huge market and then sort of try and position yourself. We are very clear about that being a realistic, that being a reality. And I think that is how the Indian policy around China has always been. Say, be it strategically, be it economically, we've always found areas of collaboration. And I think even, how US interests change every time the government changes there, we are well aware of how we cannot depend on, one country or one great power, to sort of hedge ourselves against the other. So that is how realistically we operate with respect to China. So even if things do calm down, like you're saying, that, even if, this whole trade war situation sort of calms down, even in the midst of all of this, I'm sure the Indian policymakers are looking for areas where we can sort of reach out directly to the Chinese suppliers and, sort of form those B2B collaborations or those joint ventures. Because the idea for India has always been that, we are more interested in what serves us, our domestic interests, our national interests, rather than being used as a pawn by somebody in the broader geopolitical game. Right? And that geopolitical game is playing itself out right now for critical minerals. And India is extremely well aware of the situation. And, I will not be surprised if you tomorrow see a B2B, a venture or a B2B agreement that is being signed or between, suppliers from China and manufacturers in India. So I'll not be completely surprised by something like this if that comes up. Because realistically, that is how things are looking for India. And that is how they should be, right? So, I don't see, at least from Indian point of view, I don't see the situation or the policies drastically changing themselves according to how the geopolitical picture changes. So, we are going to be more we are going to be more calibrated. We are going to be more one step at a time.
Right. And you said, the concurrent efforts are ongoing in any case. So let's round off by looking at, Marina, you referred to it, that this whole thing becomes important in the context of green energy transition. And that is something which is a common goal for all countries. Selling cars is one part of it, or a subset of it, but the larger thing is green energy transition. So any last thoughts on how we should be looking at this whole challenge of lithium and the race for lithium, as we started by talking about it, in the context of green energy transition, and what should we be maybe doing differently or looking at differently as we look ahead?
Well, I wrote an article with a colleague last year, and we're arguing that, for each individual country, let's say in Asia Pacific, if for them to form a partnership with China, and they feel that relationship is not sustainable because of the disparity in power between China and an Asian country, including India, for many reasons. But Asia Pacific actually can, especially ASEAN countries, can form a kind of coalition to work together with China. And if China seems a threat to a single country, but China cannot be a threat to a bunch of countries, especially in Asia Pacific, because China is not that silly to mess up the relationship with all neighbors. So if that kind of partnership can be forced, and China actually could share the technology and using the resources with those countries and the labor of those countries. And the technology is not just about processing, it's also about building infrastructure. For example, clean electricity, because we know critical mineral is energy consumption, is energy intensive industry. And China has learned a hard lesson to develop technologies, including waste management of mineral processing. So those can be built at least with targeted markets, let's say, not for military usage. And that can benefit, let's say, a large proportion of the global population in terms of green energy transition. So I don't think China is necessarily wants to be isolated. China develops a technology, develops a products, and they want to sell to the world. I had this feeling when I went to see this new EV showroom in Sydney. The reality is the competition in China is so fierce. If you don't go abroad, you won't be able to make money. And largely, fundamentally, you just mentioned, all those investors in Indonesia, in Congo, and in Latin America, most of them actually private businesses. They're not state-owned enterprises. And what they want profits. Meanwhile, if they can do things that help conquer the climate challenge, that's a really good win-win situation. I think this really is not just about trade; it's about diplomacy.
Right. Thanks for that, Marina. Niharika, last word on as viewed through the lens of green transition.
No, I agree with Marina here. I don't think climate change is a zero-sum game, and we cannot look at it as a zero-sum game. This is a collective problem which needs to be resolved collectively. I think the downside to whatever is happening is that we've securitized climate change, we've securitized clean energy technologies, we've securitized green transition, but that's not going to solve your problem. That's only going to aggravate your problem, right? So I think we need more collaboration. We need countries to sort of identify exactly how self-interest works, and then how collaboration is going to sort of, minimize the negatives and maximize the positives. I do understand that some of these minerals have, implications for the defense industry, for security, which has gained prominence over the last couple of years. But the major challenge that is facing us right in our faces is climate change. And this is going to impact people massively. And, the quickly we resolve it, the quickly we move together to resolve it, I think better for all of us. Sadly, the greatest power, the country with the greatest amount of power has denied, climate change, the realities of climate change. But that doesn't mean that, India and China being the two largest countries, two largest markets, don't have the incentives to collaborate. They do. There are a lot of opportunities to collaborate. And, from a personal point of view, I think that should be our ultimate game. We should be pursuing, that cooperative window that we have, at least for these non-traditional areas.
Right, and that's a fairly good and optimistic note to end on. Thank you so much, Niharika and Marina, for joining us on Take Note. Today's theme was Race for Lithium. Take Note is Asia Society's India series of in-depth explainers on emerging issues across economy, policy, and life. I'm Govindraj Ethiraj once again, and thank you to Asia Society for inviting me to be part of this as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you had a useful time understanding where we are in the race and where we could be in coming months and years. Thank you very much.